smart alecky about being a televangelist, but there are so many things to say, and not a one of them are appropriate, so here we go. Before they became institutions, every business, every religion, or government was a movement. Every institution, including organized religion, began as movements that were filled with excitement, spirit, fervor, and a desire to reform whatever came before. And as those movements grew, it became necessary to add structure. And before long, what was once a fluid, dynamic, powerful movement became an institution. And while movements sought change and reform and revolution, institutions sought to protect themselves from change, reform, and revolution. As a result, most institutions now do everything in their power to stop movements from even beginning. Jesus' teaching and ministry began as a movement. Jesus' ministry began as a movement that wanted to reform some of the teachings of the temple priests. Anytime Jesus said, "You have heard it said," he was talking about a piece of oral or spoken law that the Pharisees in the temple were trying to add to the existing laws of Moses. And every time Jesus said, "But I say," he was creating a movement to oppose and reform the teachings and the laws that were coming from the temple. So Jesus was seen as a reformer. He opposed the new oral tradition of the Pharisees in Jerusalem, and let's face it, they didn't really like that. At first, the Pharisees, with the new laws and new oral laws, debated with Jesus, but as he became more popular, they did their best to silence him, and eventually their attempts to silence Jesus turned into persecution. Now, in addition to everything else, Jesus taught his followers how to be reformers. Those who followed his teachings were encouraged to listen to the voices of compassion found in the writings of the prophets. Jesus taught his followers compassion was more important than the new holiness laws the priests were trying to institute. By his example, Jesus taught his followers how to be reformers. And the priests, the Roman Empire, and other Jews did not appreciate Jesus' followers when they tried to make reforms. At first, they would try to silence them. They'd put them in jail. Eventually, they'd let them out, and they'd start talking again. So ultimately, Jesus' followers were persecuted. Now, one of Jesus' followers, John Wesley, the priest from the Church of England, who's given credit for founding Methodism, he was a reformer. He wanted to reform the way the Church of England was handling the Industrial Revolution. Wesley taught a way of life that felt a lot like a method. He told his followers to rise early. He got up at 4:30. That's way beyond my ability. He got up at 4:30 to pray, to study, to worship, and to fast. His followers were taught to abstain from alcohol, not go to bars, to eliminate rich food from their diet, to not gamble, to not wear fancy clothes, and to avoid entertainment of the day. In other words, everything that was popular in 18th century England. Now, others in England thought of Wesley's followers as reformers, and they were derisively called Methodists in their attempt to silence them. Even so, the movement grew, and within 100 years, the movement that Wesley began grew and became an institution. And now, 250 years after its beginning, our denomination has become an institution known as a mainline church. Now, a mainline church is one that is historic and well established. It's solid, and it changes very, very, very slowly. A mainline church is an institution designed to maintain and protect the institution. And when reformers begin to attract crowds and become too popular, the institution does its best to silence the movement, to make the reformers be quiet. And if the reformers continue to try to make changes, they become known as troublemakers. And troublemakers in any institution, but especially organized religion, often face punishment. invitations to leave the church, and eventually trials. Those labeled troublemakers by the institution are persecuted. Now, Jesus said those who were persecuted would be happy and blessed, for they would experience the kingdom of heaven. Jesus told his followers the reforms they were trying to make would allow them to experience his presence which was literally heaven on earth. We live in a world filled with institutions that were once dynamic movements. We live in a world where mainline anything has become mainstream everything. What was once dynamic and exciting has become conventional, usual, predictable, and too often unchanging, even when change is demanded. We live in a world where reformers are ridiculed, silenced, and persecuted when they try to make changes to the institutions that have come to serve themselves more than the others they were originally built to serve. Now, as followers of Jesus, most of us have become really comfortable being part of a mainline denomination. And too often our denomination is not just mainline, it is mainstream, unchanging even when the Spirit demands change. And most of us have become really comfortable being part of a mainline world that is too often a mainstream world. We've grown comfortable being part of the majority, part of the conventional, part of the predictable, part of the slow to change people. We're comfortable, so we protect ourselves from change by protecting the mainstream institutions that serve only mainstream people. We have forgotten that Jesus wanted his followers to be reformers. We've forgotten Jesus wanted his followers to show compassion for those who were not part of the main line or part of the mainstream. We've forgotten that Jesus spent his time with the poor, the lonely, the immigrants, the outcasts, and the children. We have forgotten that the church began as a movement that shaped policy instead of an institution that became shaped by policy. We've forgotten that Jesus started a movement that changed the world. And organized religion has now become a group of people that are too often changed by the world. We've forgotten when the mainstream is trying to silence us, we're probably doing something right. Jesus asked his followers to embrace a way of life that found joy by serving God through serving God's people and God's creation. He asked his followers to challenge institutions that were more invested in protecting the status quo than they were in caring for their people and for the world. He taught his followers to teach, heal, and offer hope to those who had no hope. He told his followers to offer food, clean water, shelter, clean air, clothing, and compassion to those who were not being cared for. Jesus worked for change in people's lives, and he worked for change in mainline institutions of their time until he was finally silenced on the cross. Jesus asks us to be part of a movement that brings reform to our lives and to our world today. Reforming our lives means giving our devotion to the teachings of Jesus, who is our Christ. Reforming our lives means letting God to go to work on us, so we're less interested in protecting the way we want to do things and more interested in serving those whose needs are not being met. Jesus asked his followers to be part of an institution that brings reform to our world today. And in fact, if we're not upsetting an institution that serves itself more than it serves its people that it's supposed to serve, we're probably living more in the mainstream than we are in the movement of Jesus Christ. If we're not disturbed by something a mainline institution is doing or not doing, we've probably become too immersed in the mainstream. As the COVID-19 pandemic deepens in our area, we have more and more opportunities to reform those things that have become mainstream in our lives. We have the opportunity to reform ourselves for mainstream people into reformers by offering childcare and education supervision to families with children who are not in school and where the adults must go to work. We can offer meals to those who work in nursing homes, healthcare centers, and over-the-road truckers. Now, we don't have to take the hot dishes into the places. We put a bag lunch together, we call them and say, we're bringing it, drop it off at the doorstep, let them pick it up. We can give generously to those whose hours at work are being cut or eliminated. We can support local businesses as they attempt to survive in the midst of social distancing and closures. We can allow families without internet to use ours. We can offer those who feel trapped in their homes letters, phone calls, and even visits from across the street as we wave and holler at each other. We can insist that our city, our county, our state, and our nation provide for those who cannot provide for themselves. We can share the food and paper goods that we have stockpiled with those who are not able to get to the stores, as well as those who could not afford to buy enough for themselves. We can work to reform policies that reward selfishness, fear-mongering, and greed until we get glimpses of Jesus standing beside us. We can demand policies that set trends that rather than react to trends. We can demand organized religion work for Jesus rather than for the institutions that were created in his name. Reform isn't easy. It takes a willingness to stand beside ourselves and look at those places where we have made our lives an institution. To look at those places where we have become so set in how we think and so set in how we treat ourselves and other people that we're willing to look and say, where have I missed what Jesus was saying to me? Where have I become so set in what I believe that I'm not willing to let God go to work on me and change my heart? Where have I become so set in meeting my needs that I've forgotten to care for my neighbors? All of God's people. All of God's critters, all of God's creation. Because once we let God start to reform us, we cannot help but begin to reform those institutions that have forgotten their job is to care for all of us rather than protect themselves. Lakeshore can become a congregation that is a movement of spirit, excitement, and reform. We can become reformers who are persecuted for demanding righteousness and compassion in every aspect of our lives and our communities. In fact, I hope God goes to work on us so much that we become eager to embrace the time when people look at us and say, oh, Methodists again. Because blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. May we experience the kingdom of heaven right now. May we feel the Spirit moving in our hearts. May we feel the Spirit moving in our lives. May we feel the Spirit saying, wait a minute. Step outside yourself and let me go to work. Because you've heard it said, but I say. Amen.
Amen.